Hello, everyone. Scott Sigrist. Now we're going to do our lesson on Christian political theory, focusing on the two greatest Christian political theorists in terms of philosophical penetration and influence, and that is Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, um, often called Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas Aquinas because they've been sainted by the Roman Catholic Church as great doctors of the Church, which means great philosophers and theologians, scholars. Augustine, we'll start with Augustine. His great political work is The City of God. And the context of the City of God is that Rome has just been sacked by the Visigoths in 410. Uh, and as often happens with people who undergo a disaster, they want somebody to blame. They want a scapegoat. And their scapegoat was the Christians. Christianity had been a growing force in the empire. By now, um, Constantine has risen up about 100 years before Constantine established himself in the east, Constantinople, and eventually declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And this kind of went back and forth on uh, whether Christianity was the official religion, but it ended up sticking. Um, but a lot of Romans were thinking these Christians, they're not good Romans. They have divided loyalties. They um, have a loyalty. Their highest loyalty is not to Rome, as it is for us, but to this God. Not even a Roman God. Um, they've abandoned the Roman gods and taken this new God, and worse, they claim it's the only God. All of our gods are not really gods, or even some of them say they're demons. They're wicked beings, and these Christians, I think they're really the cause of all. They're why we're so weak, why we could be sacked. Rome, the eternal city. Rome, it's not supposed to happen, but Rome is sacked. And so Augustine, the initial purpose of the book is to answer the critics of Christianity in this context, those who are attacking Christianity, blaming them for this disaster. But the work turns into this vast work of political theory and a philosophy of history. It's about 1,000 pages long, so it is really massive. Um, the and I'll stress that point on the philosophy of history. This is the first great philosophy of history. Uh, the um, the classics, the Greek thinkers, had seen history as cyclical, just, rise and fall of cities and nations and empires, and there's no particular meaning to it. There's no direction to it. Christians thought there was a direction to history, and this had a massive impact on people's way of thinking about history, um, with long-term consequences, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. Um, but the work starts off in the in the preface. Augustine contrasts the City of God, which he's going to trace through the progression of the City of God through time, and the earthly city. Uh, the City of God is not to be confused, he explains, with the visible church. There may be, and there are, he assumes, many people in the visible church who are not in the City of God. And by the same token, there are many people who live in uh, earthly cities who don't identify with the visible church who are in the city of God. Because the two cities are spiritual cities. And they're composed by the distinguishing factor is the spiritual orientation of the people in those cities. Rome is the sort of quintessential earthly city, but it is not identical with the earthly city. Rome is a physical city uh, as well, but it's a particularly good manifestation of the earthly city. And so there's a lot of focus on Rome, Rome's history, and but to contrast initially that set up and developed much more deeply in the course of the book is between the highest love of the city of God and that of the earthly city, and the fact that the city of God, one of its great virtues uh, for true citizens of the city of God is humility, um, whereas one of the virtues of the earthly city, as exemplified nowhere else better than Rome, is glory. And glory, not in the sense, not in the right way. The glory of Rome, Augustine suggests, what really boiled down to what he called libido dominandi. It's an important technical term that will continue to be important, but it means lust for domination. What Rome was really driven by was lust for domination. And lust is a kind of love, a kind of perverse love, and so these things are connected. The the humility of the city of God is connected with the fact that they love God above themselves, and the pride of the earthly city is connected with the fact that they love themselves above God. This is the uh, specific difference between the people in the two cities. The people in the city of God love God, as Augustine puts it, even to the contempt of self, whereas the earthly city loves self even to the contempt of God. So that's your specific dividing line. And again, keep this distinction between these spiritual communities and the physical manifestations of them that are more complex. The earthly city, you could say, is well, it's not identical to any of the earthly cities in the plural, physical places that you could go. There were lots of people in the city of God who lived in earthly cities. They all did. Right? There were no earthly cities that were completely composed of people in the city of God. So hopefully that part's clear enough. Um, let's start with a kind of diagram of Augustine's view of history. If you look at this diagram, Augustine's view of humanity was that man lives, as Plato had put it too, in between transcendence, the eternal reality beyond this world, and immanence, the earthly reality. In fact, if you look back at the diagram I gave you for Plato's idea of the human situation, you can see this again. Remember the golden cord image? So the symbolization of the image was that, man, if this is the human soul, this circle, man is like a puppet pulled in many directions by many cords, and they're the steely cords of passion which tend to pull him down to, you could say in Augustine's terms, earthly things, and then the golden cord of reason pulls man upward towards the noble things and ultimately towards the divine. And this is Plato's technical term for that was living in the metaxy, Metaxy. It meant in between. Man lives in the in between. And Augustine takes this further. Augustine, by the way, remember, is very much influenced by Plato. You can see fingerprints of Plato all over the City of God. So man, not only as an individual, but as communities, and ultimately these two great spiritual communities live in the in-between. Well, let me refine that a little bit. The people in the City of God include, I should say the beings in the City of God, include not only people here in this world, but people beyond. Everyone who has been in the City of God and died, and is in eternity now, is in the City of God. All the angels, these intermediate beings between man and God, are also included in the City of God. God Himself and Jesus, God's representative, all are in the City of God, compose the City of God, and the King, the ruler of the City of God, is Christ, Jesus Christ, in this understanding, right? So this is a vast. You see, it goes beyond this world. This is this world, and the city goes beyond. Not drawn to scale. How would you do that? I don't know. But the historical point is that the City of God is not static. Man lives in the in-between, but he's going somewhere. There is a final destination. And the Christian idea is that history has a direction. God is moving the city of God in this world, that portion of it in this world, humanity, towards an ultimate destination beyond this world. Contrast that with the earthly city, which has that kind of cyclical form that the classics understood history as having. It's just, as it's been put, just one damn thing after another. History doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't have any trajectory or whatever. And Augustine accepted that for the earthly city. The earthly city, in a certain sense, at least in this world, is not going anywhere. It doesn't have any direction, except for the fact that ultimately they will, end up separated from God. The technical term there is hell. And I drew these rectangles to indicate the earthly cities. Again, people in the City of God here live in earthly cities, but they are not in the spiritual earthly city. And of course, the people in the earthly city live in cities as well. But these earthly cities are not particularly going anywhere. Rome is going to end. The Roman Empire is going to ultimately end, and so with any other empire. So with the United States. So with all the great cities and regimes in history. They're all gonna go the way of Greece and Rome. But yet, this is another important factor. God in this world is moving all of this, catching all of this up into His purposes. So even the earthly cities and the activity of the people in the earthly city, the spiritual community, is all being used by God for His purposes. Out of the evil of the world, He brings good. Doesn't diminish the evil of it, but He brings good out of it, and for His ultimate purposes. And the word for this that the Christians used was providence. God's providence was this superintendence of the universe, moving all things toward His plan. Now, one of the long-term consequences of this, or the way of thinking about this, is this became the Western way of thinking about history. And all of the, you've heard politicians sometimes say, well, you're on the wrong side of history. You need to get on the right side of history. And this assumes that history has a trajectory, a direction. You see people both on the left and the right doing this. Um, for example, George W. Bush would never, wouldn't be considered certainly by people on the left or liberals to be liberal, but he talked about history having an arc towards justice and moving people towards greater freedom, which sounds a whole lot like Hegel, who will be very influenced by these ideas, not always consciously. But the Augustinian vision of history, or the Christian vision of history, as articulated by Augustine, would dramatically shape the way Westerners thought about history, and for good and ill. One of the problems with the later forms of this is that the direction of history going into the beyond, as Augustine understood it, the later thinkers would try to bring the arrow down here to make the end of history, to use Hegel's term, in this world, and to be achieved by human beings through political means. For Augustine, history was directed by God. It was a mysterious process. We don't know exactly how it works. We don't know exactly what the destination looks like. It's beyond this world. But for others who, the modern way of thinking, especially the more God got out of the picture, but even with God in the picture, this heaven on earth, utopian kind of vision, and activism related to that. We can make it happen. How about Marx is the most famous example of this. Okay, history has a process. I recognize the process, and he gets this from Hegel, whose theory he inverts. Hegel made it was kind of a spiritual process, was a big part of it. Marx is a materialist; he doesn't accept any of that. But history has this process. I figured it out. I know where it's going. It's inevitable that it's going to end this way, but we can accelerate the process. We can help it get there faster. So this philosophy of history becomes tremendously important. Now, Augustine, as Christians generally did, talked about the basic human problem in terms of sin, right? It wasn't really that different from the idea that Plato and Aristotle had about the corrupting effects of passions. In fact, Augustine says it's a matter of what you love the most that makes you what you are. And for him, for Christians, it's supposed to be God, to love God above all, right? And he dissects the problem of sin, which the Greeks called the problem of the passions, in terms of bad love and bad will. The problem with human beings is that their will has been corrupted. What they choose to do has been corrupted. They choose the wrong things, right? But the root of this is bad love, that they've loved the wrong things, or they've loved things out of order. So if you think of, again, of Plato's hierarchy of loves from the, I have that, I believe I have that over here. This is not effective use of airtime, but might as well put this up again. You remember this chart from the Plato lecture, Plato's classification of regimes, and they were determined by their dominant love, right? If you love good and virtue, that's a good regime. Honor, it's a step down. Wealth, freedom, or pleasure, power. These are. This is the order of loves, the right order of loves, and these things are all fine if they're loved in the right order. But if they're loved out of order, it's corrupting, it's disordering of the soul and of the city. depending on what the city loves. And so the problem of sin is the problem of bad loves. And the question of becoming virtuous and just and so on is to get the right loves, to turn them in the right direction. And so Christianity is supposed to point you to the correct object of love, to God, right? Um, and you get along with this a refined, or uh, from his perspective at least, a refined notion of virtue from what the Greeks uh, gave. So again, if you get that golden cord image in the myth of the puppet player, the uh, what the counterpull. Remember, Plato had said, to live a good life, you have to counterpull against the steely cords of passion that pull you down to baser things, and you have to uh, yield to or respond to, or let yourself be pulled by these um, uh, the higher things, the more noble desires, and this is exactly what uh, Augustine is saying, but the virtues that relate to these getting these steely cords of passion in order, these were the cardinal virtues. Remember, cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And Augustine accepts all of that, but he says for that to all work, there's this process, and this line is supposed to go up, or speculated to go up by the Athenian stranger in the laws, to divine, to divine, the transcendent divine good, as he called it, as Socrates called it in the Republic. And the Christians had a specific term, specific virtues related to this, to the pull up to the divine, which were um, labeled by St. Paul as faith, hope, and love. And this came to be called by the Christians the spiritual virtues. So they were the cardinal virtues, which were foundational moral virtues, right, uh, along with the intellectual virtue of wisdom. But the idea was that to activate all of these virtues, to complete them, uh, one needed these spiritual virtues, which came from God, came from responsiveness to God, and um, so so the uh, so the cardinal virtues depended on the spiritual virtues. Um, and then so justice ends up taking special meaning too. Justice is formed by a right relation to transcendent divine reality. Um, and you remember Socrates had linked up justice and happiness. That is, the just person is truly just person is the truly happy person. And Augustine takes this a step further to say, well, um, justice is ultimately determined by these spiritual virtues, and the highest of those virtues is love. That's the culminating of faith, hope, and love. And the ultimate happiness, Augustine says, not that far off from Plato, but Augustus says the highest is enjoying God, participating in God, which was a term that Plato and Aristotle used. This participation in uh, divine spiritual being, how we want to put that. Um, and so, yes, like the Greeks, happiness was a product of virtue, but this all depended on this reception of divine influence. Not so different from the Greeks, but a heavier emphasis on that divine uh, participation in us and our participation in the divine. Um, And related to all of this, it was so the suggestion here is that virtuous people, uh, depending on this connection with the divine, was found in an actual city. You remember Plato and Aristotle had said there is no really just city. Uh, there has never been one that's existed. It was unlikely that one will ever exist. We have a conception of the best regime, and this should be a standard for us to approximate, and so forth. And Augustine would have agreed that no earthly city has ever been truly just or will ever be truly just. But there is one actual just city in this world, and that is the spiritual city of the city of God. Because all those who love God over themselves have the right order of love, they therefore become virtuous. And this is the best regime. The best regime is the city of God. And it's not just hypothetical, it actually exists. And not only beyond, but in this world. So you can see all the parallels with Plato. Um, and so the ranking of regimes for Augustine also is determined by loves. And um, working with Cicero's definition of a city, a res publica, which means the public thing. Public thing is a thing of the people, and then Cicero defines the people, or a people, as those who are in agreement about, essentially, you could say, the common good and justice. What is in the good of the city? What is the common interest of the city? And what is justice? And there's I won't go into the details of Augustine's analysis of Cicero's argument, but he tweaks it in a more Platonic direction to say that the cities are determined by what they love, whatever they think is the highest good, and love that, therefore, is going to determine what kind of community that is. So he's right along with Plato there. Now, some new problems come up with Christianity, political problems based on Christian assumptions. New challenges is another way you can put it. First was this competing loyalties, or this possibility of competing loyalties. And there always would be, because the earthly cities were never fully just, and they were going to sometimes demand things that weren't just. And if that ever happened, if there was a conflict between the demands of the city and the demands of God, as Christians understood it, then they would have to go with God. There was a higher loyalty, and that led to the question, and Augustine was asked specifically about this: do Christians make good citizens? Are they really, since they're citizens of another world, another dimension, if you will, and their ultimate destination is beyond this world? Are they too otherworldly? Are they too focused on this higher loyalty to be good citizens? And Augustine makes the case that they are the best citizens because they're virtuous and they care about the things of this world. They just use them for a higher purpose than people in the earthly city do. And that whole argument is very much worth thinking about. It connects to the whole idea of higher law, that there are standards above the regime to which one can appeal if the regime becomes unjust. So this is really theoretically very important. The last thing I'll mention on Augustine, excuse me while I take a drink here, is his just war theory. Now, he doesn't give a theory, he doesn't have a work on just war. We can glean it from some things he said in The City of God, but especially some things he said in some letters, people who are asking about how Christians can view war. There was a sub tradition in Christianity of pacifism, that war was never acceptable. And Augustine disagreed with that. Uh, and here were the basic points about war and just war. Augustine's starting place is to kind of ask the question, what is wrong with war? What is it that's bad about war? I mean, he assumes that it's bad. And he says, it's not that people die. Everyone's going to die. And death is not the worst thing. He would have agreed with Socrates on that point. Death is by far not the worst thing. The worst thing is spiritual destruction, the internal destruction. And that comes with being corrupt, with being disordered inside. And that's what's wrong with war. That's the great evil of war. I mean, it's wrong to kill people when you shouldn't, obviously, physically, and all that kind of physical destruction. But what's most evil about war is the spiritual destruction, and the spiritual destruction that comes specifically from that lust for domination that is always a factor in war, especially in the aggressor side. Um, so, um, so again, you have the spiritual priority even in wartime, and so this fits in with the just war theory that if there are things worse than dying, like perhaps being tyrannized over by a corrupt people or by anyone, um, then there may come a time when someone has to fight for it. And he comes up with a number of statements that developed into the basic principles of just war, three categories of it. And we call it the principles of just war. I haven't made anything that spells out the words. It's three Latin terms. I'll spell them out for you verbally. That are the root of it. There is something called jus ad bellum, which means justice in going to the war, towards war, justice towards war, literally. So, what is a just cause of war? That's jus ad bellum, J-U-S A-D B-U-L-L-U-M. B-E-L-L-U-M, I'm sorry. There's a second category, which is jus in bello, J-U-S-I-N-B-E-L-L-O, which means justice in war, justice during war, just conduct in war. And it goes to the whole issue of, are there things, even in wartime, that should be off limits? Excuse me. Excuse me. But the last thing is jus post bellum, justice after war, or a just conclusion to a war. So that's J-U-S post, P-O-S-T dash B-E-L-L-U-M, jus post bellum. And I won't go into all of the things that Augustine says about this, but you can pick it up in the readings. But you can categorize them according to those categories. But one of the reasons that war is sometimes necessary is the protection of the innocent and the taming of the aggressors to prevent them from doing more aggression. And I just mentioned several criteria of just war. It needs to be necessary, which is somewhat of a judgment call, obviously, but unless they're invading you or something, there's often a certain amount of judgment. At what particular point, is war necessary outside of a situation of just direct attempted conquest? They're trying to invade, take you over, attack you, whatever. That one's pretty clear cut. It's pretty easy. Um, um, it, the the key principle would be protecting the innocent, and that means providing for, Augustine says, a just peace. That's the proper end, or the proper aim of going to war, to reestablish a peace and a just peace. And he explains that tyranny is not a just peace; it's an unjust peace. It's a peace, perhaps, where uh, you know, uh, factions and conflict and so forth are crushed by the tyrant, but it's not a just peace. I'll leave it at that on just war, but just to kind of help you categorize, Thomas Aquinas, I can take him a little quicker. The the name is really Thomas. Aquinas is a Latinization of Aquino, which is the city where he was from. So it's Thomas of Aquino, technically. And so you often hear him called just Thomas. You hear his philosophy and philosophy derivative of him called Thomistic. So I'll call him Thomas from here on. I mentioned to you that Thomas, in a previous lecture, that Thomas is his Summa Theologica, which is his great work of theology. It means literally like the complete theology, a complete Christian vision of the world put into principles. In that, he relied heavily on Aristotle, simply called often the philosopher. And everyone knew, because of Aristotle's influence in the Middle Ages, who the philosopher meant. The Summa Theologica, you could see, is sort of a great synthesis of Christianity and Aristotle. And so this cements the Aristotelian Christian tradition that I mentioned to you as the dominant tradition of political theory until the rise of modernity. The key thing, or the most original and most important thing in terms of an original influence on political theory by Thomas, is his discussion in the Summa of law. What law is, what the types of law are, what the relation is between human law and higher standards, and so forth. And also some suggestive comments about the possibility of resisting tyranny, resisting unjust law. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So the basic, we'll start with the definition of law for Aquinas, for Thomas. It says law has four parts. For it to be genuinely a law, to really count as law as opposed to just imposition of someone's will, it has to have four components. First, it has to be rational. It has to be a dictate of reason. Secondly, and this is essentially what makes it rational, it has to aim at the common good, not the good of any particular group, not the interest of the ruler. Remember Aristotle's categories here. But the common good. The third element of law is that it must be made by a proper authority, someone duly appointed to represent the people in whatever way. It is not implying any particular form of government, but the government is the one with authority to make laws. So if somebody rises up and imposes something on a segment of the population, that's not authorized. That's not due authority, and therefore it's not really law. The fourth thing is promulgation, which means just publication, making the law known. People can't be expected to obey a law that they don't know anything about. They have to know what the standard is to comply with it. So those are the four elements of law: reason, the common good, authority, proper authority, and promulgation. And then he applies that. To understand his categories of law, you have to apply those elements to the four different kinds of law. So there's four kinds of law. He says there's eternal law, natural law, divine law, and human law. Now that terminology is somewhat confusing because all of the first three, eternal, natural, and divine, are divine in origin. I mean, they're all God's laws in a certain respect. So let me explain. So the eternal law is the law of divine providence. That is, the law by which God is directing the whole universe. He's directing it according to his reason, towards the common good of the whole universe. He obviously has authority. He's the only one who would have authority to have such a law, such a standard, a principle of action. That's a kind of root of the idea of law that Thomas mentions earlier. A rule of action. The problem is with the eternal law is that it's very mysterious to us. I mean, how is God directing history? How does all this work? Like Augustine, Thomas accepted that we can't know that in large part. But he does suggest that we can know part of it. And there are two ways we can know the eternal law. In other words, two ways the eternal law is promulgated, made known to us. One of them is through natural law, and this is the law of moral truth. It's the moral law. And this law is promulgated to us through our conscience, our reason. Conscience is, Aquinas understands it as a subset of reason. It's reason recognizing principles of right, of how you should live. So we can know something about the divine purpose through our ability to recognize right and wrong. And we can see this actually built into ourselves. I mean, he understands human virtue in the way Aristotle does. It's what it's what our capacities are when fully developed, when we reach our potential, or what it would look like if we did reach our potential. And Thomas puts this in terms of inclinations. We have certain natural inclinations as human beings, natural drives, whatever you can call them, that incline us towards a certain end. And we may not reach those potentials, but that's what we aim for. Remember, Aristotle says everything aims at the good, meaning it wants it reaches out for what is good for it. May not succeed, may not be conditions in place where it can be entirely successful, but that's the idea. And Thomas indicates, and this goes along with the order of nature idea, that there are three classes of inclinations in human beings. The first level, the lowest level, is the drive for self-preservation. So here he's on board with Hobbes, right? So everything boils down to self-preservation. All living things have an impulse for self-preservation. Even plants, remember the plants, they lean towards the sun, animals, and to accept the human being is an animal, we desire self-preservation too. So, and this suggests certain principles and moral guidelines for us that we should take care of ourselves, we should take care of our health, um, and so on. The second uh, level of inclinations is, and I'll use Locke's term here. Locke sort of alludes to it here. The inclination to preserve the species is other oriented. It's something that all animals have, as seen in their instinct to care for their own, to have offspring and take care of them, and so forth. So there's natural inclination to be with others of your kind and to it's just natural sympathy, sentiments, however they might put it later on in political theory. That's another human inclination, and that suggests, in terms of moral principles, that we ought to take care of our children, provide for their health, safety, education, and so forth. Just, in other words, let those natural, positive, other-oriented passions come to fruition. But then there's a third level, and this is what puts human beings beyond other animals, and that is the human rational capacity and the desire ultimately to know God, or to know about God is the way he puts it, I guess, but ultimately to know God in that participatory way. To live, the two things he says, to live in a political community, which is a rational community, he understands it the way Aristotle does, community where that is concerned about right and wrong, justice and injustice, what's useful, and so forth. So we desire to be part of a political community, rational community in the full sense, rational in the sense of trying to understand how we should live, and then desires to know God or the truth about God. And I think one way I like to put this is human beings have an inclination to want to be part of a community of meaning, including the meaning, the highest meaning, the ultimate meaning, which would lead you towards the divine. And this suggests other moral obligations, moral standards, that we should try to cultivate a relationship with the divine, that we should try to be part of a contributing part of a political community, and so forth. So this structure of human nature and these inclinations suggest something about God's purpose for us. That's the idea, right? And that's how the eternal law, or God's providential plan, is promulgated to us through our ability to reason about our makeup and conscience, what conscience tells us, and so forth. The other divine law, which he calls divine law, he means by this the law of revelation, the law of what we get through the Bible, how the Bible is supposed to direct us to our ultimate good. And so this is another way that God, this is a way, the natural law, we can know, we don't have to be religious, we don't have to be Christians to recognize basic right and wrong. The natural law is available to everyone, but the law of revelation, this divine law, is known only to those who have the revelation, and it has to be accepted by faith, right? But it's rational. I mean, one of Thomas's points about Christianity is, well, you couldn't have reasoned your way to it, but once you see it, you can see how it makes sense and how it completes, gives you what you may have known you needed to know, but didn't know. What's the relation between these divinely supplied laws and human law? This is a critical question for politics. How do we make just laws? How do we make just standards for society? Well, we need to look at those promulgations, right? And it ends up looking like this. So, one more visual aid for you. Looking like this. So, natural law and divine law are promulgated to us in these ways that I mentioned. And human law ought to be based on natural law. They ought to be based on the moral standards we can recognize through reason and conscience. And if they're not in compliance with the natural law in that sense, they're unjust. The divine law is a little more complicated for Thomas. Christians have long abandoned mainstream, if it was ever mainstream by anybody, any idea of theocracy. So divine law wasn't simply supposed to be applied to human law, political law, directly. There was a whole different set of laws that the church had: canon law, which was church law, and then there was civil law, which was political law. So in relation to political law, the main thing was that human law should not go against divine law. It should not make people do things that the divine law says you shouldn't do, or that kind of thing. And this is, I don't know if it seems ironic, but it's sort of the kernel of the principle of religious liberty. The government shouldn't make you do something against your conscience or what you think, specifically religiously related, what you think God wants for you, and so on. So that's the structure of law. Last point, I talked about the theory of resistance, or the idea of resisting an unjust government. And this comes, Thomas takes this up in the discussion of law, specifically the question of how do you respond to an unjust law that you know through natural law is unjust? What should you do? Should you obey that law? Well, and he puts this in terms of the question of, are unjust laws binding on the conscience? And his answer is no. They're not binding on the conscience. You do not have an obligation to obey such laws. And he gives a pretty big hint that this can involve outright resistance to the law. Setting up the kind of argument that Martin Luther King Jr. made in the letter from a Birmingham jail. I can obey unjust laws, these segregation laws, because there's a higher law, and that trumps it. Without sort of giving any kind of theory of revolution, Thomas suggests that there may be a time to resist. And we know he's talking about some kind of active resistance, because he says the exception to resisting an unjust law, a case where you might not resist, is if you think resisting will cause too great of a scandal or too great of negative consequences. That is, if you know to a moral certainty that the tyrant has enough power to crush the result, and that likely to be a huge massacre or whatever, then you're not. It's probably not wise or even just to resist the law in that case. But otherwise, maybe a place for it. So I'll have one more short lecture on these classics, pulling away the just takeaways, how these are all relevant for modern times. All right, sorry for the length. Hope it's worth it.